The hum of my old singer was the only constant soundtrack in my life, a sound that for 60 years cradled my children, paid my bills, and witnessed my silent tears. In that corner of the room, I stubbornly called my studio. The air smelled of reheated coffee and the dust of fabric stored for too long. Scraps of satin, cotton, and lace overflowed from wicker baskets, like colorful memories of lives I helped to dress. The walls, with their peeling paint revealing layers of other colors, were a silent map of decades of work: wedding dresses for young women who were now grandmothers, school uniforms for children who had moved far away, and countless alterations for neighbors who, over time, forgot even my name. It was a poor space, but it was mine. Every pin stuck in the pincushion, every spool of thread, was a testament to my existence. My hands, today, no longer respond as they once did. Gnarled by arthritis, my fingers refuse to obey the delicate commands the craft demands. At 76, my body is a faithful reflection of my journey. A spine curved from bending over the machine, eyesight tired from searching for the needle's eye under the yellowish light of night. I dress in clothes I mend myself, simple and worn pieces that contrast with the luxurious fabrics that so often passed through these same hands. I am a reliquary of abandonments, a museum of silent sacrifices, and the deepest wounds were stitched into my soul by the indifference of my son Ricardo, and, especially, by the calculated cruelty of my daughter-in-law Sophia. They looked at me and saw not a mother, but a tool, a domestic convenience already showing signs of rust. The door opened without a knock, an announcement of the storm to come. Sophia entered like a hurricane of expensive perfume and contempt, her stiletto heels carving marks into my old wooden floor. She did not greet me. Her eyes swept over my studio with the same disgust one looks at something dirty. In her hands, she carried a designer dress, a cascade of blue silk that seemed to offend the simplicity of the room. She threw it onto my sewing table, crumpling a paper pattern I was working on. The garment, which probably cost more than I earned in 6 months, seemed to mock everything around it, a stain of arrogance in my sanctuary of honest work. "I need this for tomorrow night," she decreed, her voice devoid of any trace of a request, only an order. "It's for the club's charity gala. The waist is a little loose." Her perfect red-nailed fingers pointed to an almost invisible seam. I took the fabric, feeling the cold, smooth silk, so different from the warm cotton I was used to. I took a deep breath, the scent of her perfume suffocating me. I looked at my own hands, which trembled slightly, and felt the sharp pain in my joints, a cruel reminder of my limitations. The late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended, awaiting my response. With the softest voice I could muster, I tried to explain. "Sophia, my dear, tomorrow is too short notice. My hands are not good today. The arthritis is punishing me. A delicate fabric like this requires a steady hand. Time." I wasn't lying. Every movement was a small agony, and the precision needed for that job was, on that day, impossible for me. I hoped for a drop of understanding, perhaps a sigh of frustration, but what I received was an eruption of contained fury, a storm brewing in her dark eyes. She stared at me, and for the first time that day she truly saw me, not as a person, but as an obstacle to her desires, an object that dared to be defective. The explosion came, not in shouts, but in a venomous hiss that cut the air deeper than any scissors. "For God's sake, Mother, stop complaining," she spat, her face contorted into a mask of impatience. "This is all you're good for. Your whole life you've acted like you were paid to serve us, and now you can't even do that, right?" Each word was a stab, precise and painful. She gestured towards my machine, my fabrics, my entire life, as if it were all proof of my subservience. The air grew heavy, and the hum of the machine, which I had turned off, still echoed in my head, now as a buzz of humiliation. I felt the floor disappear from under my feet, my small world of dignity unraveling thread by thread. Then, she uttered the word that would seal my fate, the word that would become the Needle stuck in my heart. With a contempt that froze my blood, she concluded, "You've always acted like my servant, and now you're not even good for that." Servant. The word echoed off the peeling walls, ricocheted off the spools of thread, and lodged in my chest. Maid, employee, servant. So many years of love, of sleepless nights sewing so my son could have the best clothes, of sacrifices so he could study and become the man he was today, all reduced to that single word. The sound from the street vanished, the smell of coffee disappeared, and all that existed was that offense, hanging in the air like toxic smoke. The silence that followed was more deafening than any fight. Sophia stared at me, expecting perhaps a plea, an excuse, a promise that I would try. But something inside me, something I thought was dead and buried under layers of resignation, shattered, not with a noise, but with a sharp clarity. The last thread of hope I held for some acknowledgement, for some affection from her, broke. I looked at the blue silk dress, a piece made for a charity gala, and saw the cruelest of ironies. There, in that room, charity was the last thing that existed. The humiliation was so palpable I could feel it on my skin. A rough, cold fabric. With a slow, almost ceremonial movement, I pushed the dress back towards her across the table. My lips did not move, but my eyes spoke for me. I refused. For the first time in my life, I refused a job, not out of physical inability, but out of an absolute need to preserve what was left of my soul. The surprise on Sophia's face was instant, quickly replaced by a cold anger. She did not expect resistance from a broken old tool. She snatched the dress with a sharp tug, her eyes promising future retaliation. Without another word, she turned and marched out, slamming the door with a force that shook a small picture frame on the shelf, the photo of my late husband, Antonio. I remained motionless for a long time, the sound of the slamming, Docker still vibrating inside me. The sun was setting, and the orange light streaming through the window painted my studio in tones of melancholy. I sat on my old stool, the wood groaning under my weight. I looked at my hands, trembling and sore, and for the first time in a long time, I saw not just the tools of a trade, but the hands of a woman who had allowed herself to be erased. The word servant continued to echo in my mind, undoing the seams of my self-worth one by one. In that moment, I felt completely unraveled, a useless scrap of fabric, forgotten at the bottom of a basket. The smell of cold coffee now seemed like the smell of defeat. The phantom hum of the machine was a lament. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the last rays of sun disappear behind the simple houses of our San Antonio neighborhood. Children played in the street, their laughter a painful counterpoint to the oppressive silence of my home. I had always believed my worth lay in what I could do for others, in the dresses I created, in the alterations I performed. But if all of that defined me as a servant, then what was left of Elena? Who was the woman behind the seamstress? The humiliation had emptied me, but it had also created a space for a pain so old I barely remembered its origin. The pain of abandonment, not just by Ricardo and Sophia, but by myself. I had abandoned myself somewhere along the way, traded my dreams for scraps and my desires for orders. Sophia's phrase wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis. She had merely given a name to the condition I had silently accepted for decades. "Your sewing is worth less than my time," is what her attitude had always said, and today, I finally heard it clearly. The sound of my own dignity tearing was the loudest noise I had ever heard in my life. That night, loneliness was a heavy cloak on my shoulders. The studio, my refuge, now felt like a cell. Every object was a reminder of my subservience. The measuring tape, with its worn markings, seemed to have measured only my capacity to serve. The scissors, heavy and cold, seemed to have cut only my own wings. The pain in my hands was an echo of the pain in my heart, a chronic, persistent ache that constantly reminded me of my fragility. I did not cry. Tears seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, a kind of cold settled in my chest, a void where the warmth of hope used to be. I sat in the darkness, the streetlight drawing strange shapes on the walls. The designer dress was gone, but its absence was as oppressive as its presence. It had left behind an undeniable truth. For the family I had helped build, my value had an expiration date, and it had just passed. What Sophia didn't know was that, in trying to break me, she had actually awakened something. A spark of indignation. A dangerous question began to form in my mind. What if, for the first time, I sewed something just for myself? The night was just beginning, and with it, a silent revolution, basted with the thread of pain and rediscovery. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like, subscribe, and tell me which city you're watching from. The thread of my memory took me back to my mother's kitchen on the small ranch where I grew up. I was 7 years old, and my hands could barely hold the needle. She, with the patience only mothers have, guided my clumsy fingers, teaching me to make the first stitch. Every stitch, Elena, she would say, is a promise that something torn can be mended. Sewing came into my life not as a craft, but as a lesson in resilience. I learned to mend not just fabrics, but also broken hearts and deferred dreams. When I married Antonio, the sewing machine was my dowry, the promise of a future where I could help build our home, stitch by stitch. My dreams were simple. I wanted to have a small studio, a shop with my name on the front, where the women of the neighborhood would come to chat, have coffee, and order a dress that made them feel beautiful. But the children came, and the dreams were put away in a box, along with the patterns for dresses I would never make for myself. Ricardo was born, and every penny I earned from alterations went to his education, to his shoes, so he could have more than I ever had. Sewing ceased to be an art and became survival. I sewed to pay the electricity bill, to buy medicine, to secure his future, while mine was left further and further in the past. An unfinished project. Antonio always supported me. He saw the artist in me, even when I only felt like a worker. One day, mi vida, he would tell me, massaging my tired hands at the end of the day, you will have your shop, and everyone will know the name of Elena, the best seamstress in San Antonio. He took out a life insurance policy, a modest sum, but for us, it was a fortune. This is for you, he made me promise shortly before he passed away. So you never have to depend on anyone and can finally build your dream. I kept that money, like a sacred relic, a final gesture of his love. But Ricardo and Sophia already saw it as their inheritance, their millions, as they cynically called it, just waiting for me to be gone. With my heart still shattered from Sophia's visit, I went out to the porch for some air. The night was stuffy. That's when I saw her. Isabella, my young neighbor, sitting on her front steps, crying silently. At 18, she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Orphaned as a child, she had lived in foster homes and now, recently evicted from the last one, she was trying to juggle 2 precarious jobs to avoid ending up on the street. Her appearance was the personification of exhaustion. Her waitress uniform was frayed, her shoes worn, and her face, though young, was marked by worry and loneliness. Her crying was discreet, almost ashamed, as if she didn't feel she had the right to suffer. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "What's wrong, my child?" I asked, my voice sounding more fragile than I intended. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I got fired," she whispered, her voice choked. "From the restaurant. They said I wasn't fast enough." She tried to force a smile, a pathetic attempt to mask her pain. "I guess I'm not good at anything, Elena." In that moment, seeing her helplessness, her feeling of being useless and disposable, I saw myself. The same pain, the same invisibility. The word servant echoed in my mind, and I understood that humiliation has many faces, but the same wounded soul. I sat down next to her, the silence stretching between us for a few minutes. I didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, I looked at the thin jacket she wore to protect herself from the evening dew. A clearly second-hand piece with a visible tear near the elbow. "Come," I said, getting up. "Let's fix that." She looked at me, confused. but followed me into my house, to my small studio. I turned on the yellowish light above the sewing machine, the scene of my recent humiliation, and for the first time that night, it didn't feel like a prison, but a place of healing. I asked her to take off the jacket and placed it under the needle of my singer. As I worked, the familiar hum of the machine filled the silence. I chose a thread of the exact shade of blue, so the patch would be almost invisible. Isabella watched me, fascinated. "My grandmother used to sew," she said softly. "She used to say that mending a piece of clothing was like giving a story a second chance." Those words touched me deeply. She didn't see a simple repair. She saw the art, the meaning. She saw what Ricardo and Sophia could never see. She saw the love in every stitch. In a few minutes, the tear was gone, replaced by a firm, discreet seam. I reinforced the loose buttons and used the steam iron to remove the marks of time. When I handed the jacket back to her, Isabella's eyes lit up. She put it on and looked at herself in an old mirror on the wall. A genuine smile, the first I had, seen from her in weeks, brightened her face. "It's perfect," she said, her voice full of a gratitude that seemed too immense for a simple repair. "No one has ever done anything like this for me." That gesture, so small and routine for me, was for her an act of care, of being seen. In that moment, I knew the value of my work wasn't in the price I was paid, but in the feeling it could evoke. Isabella's joy was a balm for the wound Sophia had opened. It was then that the decision formed in my mind, clear and unshakable as the needle piercing the fabric. Antonio's insurance policy, the money my son and daughter-in-law coveted, waiting for me to die to get their hands on it. "It's for you to build your dream," my husband's voice echoed in my memory. And I realized my dream had changed. It was no longer about a shop with my name on the front. It was about dignity. It was about giving a story a second chance. It was about using the love Antonio left me to sow a future for the only person who had offered me genuine affection, the only one who saw an artist where others saw a servant. I would use every cent of that money for Isabella, so she could study, so she could dream, so she would never again have to cry for being considered too slow. It was a radical decision, a silent act of rebellion against years of being devalued. I wasn't just giving her the money. I was investing in the only person who saw value in me. I was taking the inheritance of a past love to sow a future of hope. That night, under the yellowish light of my studio, I was no longer Ricardo's seamstress or Sophia's servant. I was Elena, the architect of a new destiny. The next day, I told Isabella my plan. The disbelief on her face was moving. She refused, said it was too much, that she didn't deserve it. "Deserving has nothing to do with it," I told her, holding her young, calloused hands. "This is about choice, and I choose you." It took me days to convince her, but when she finally accepted, with tears in her eyes and a promise that she would honor every cent, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. The first step was her education. We went together to the local community college and paid the tuition for her first year of a business administration course. Her eyes, as she held the receipt, were the very picture of renewed hope. The news, as expected, reached Ricardo and Sophia. Their fury was immediate and overwhelming. They showed up at my door, not with Sophia's cold arrogance, but with a raging desperation. "Have you gone mad, mother?" Ricardo shouted, his face red. "Giving our money to a stranger, a user? That's $50,000. Dad's money." The way he said, "our money," turned my stomach. He had never once asked how I was getting by, had never contributed a cent to the household bills. But the inheritance money, that was his. Sophia was even more venomous. "She's senile," she said, looking at Ricardo as if I weren't there. "It's clear she's no longer fit to manage her own money. We need to take action, maybe have her committed. It's for her own good." The threat hung in the air, cold and calculated. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted to imprison me, to take control of what they believed was theirs by right. The accusation of senility was the weapon they would use to invalidate my decision, to turn me from a mother into a problem to be managed. The pain of those words was deep, but this time it did not break me. The determination I felt was an armor. My internal conflict, however, was a constant battle. At night, when silence filled the house, Sophia's voice echoed in my mind. Servant. Senile. User. Could they be right? Was I being foolish, trading the financial security Antonio left me for a sentimental impulse? The fear of being used again, of being seen as a pawn in someone else's game, was a ghost that haunted me. I would look at my trembling hands and question my own judgment. Maybe I was just a lonely old woman, desperate for any crumb of affection. The community around me didn't help either. News travels fast in small neighborhoods, and soon I became the topic of conversation at the grocery store. Elena's lost her mind, I heard one neighbor whisper to another. Giving her life savings to that girl nobody knows where she came from. She's spending her own son's future on someone who doesn't deserve it. The judgment was veiled but constant. The isolation grew. The same people for whom I had made baptism gowns and carnival costumes now looked at me with a mixture of pity and disapproval, making me feel even more alone in my decision. But then, amidst this storm of doubts and criticism, small gestures from Isabella anchored me to my conviction. She started helping me around the house without being asked. She would bring me my plate of food when she saw I was tired, read the bank letters to me since my eyesight was failing, and spend hours in the studio, just keeping me company, learning the names of the fabrics and the function of each tool. She asked for nothing, only gave her time and affection. Her respect for me was palpable, a silent reverence that contrasted violently with the contempt of my own family. One day, she came home from college with her eyes shining. She had gotten the highest grade on her first math test. She showed me the paper with an A circled in red, as if it were a trophy. "I never thought I was capable of this, Elena," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." In that moment, all my doubts dissipated. I wasn't being foolish. I was being the person my mother taught me to be, the person Antonio loved. I was using my hands, no longer to mend fabrics, but to weave a new life, for myself and for her. I raised the stakes. With a portion of the remaining money, after securing Isabella's second year of studies, I decided it was time to unearth my old dream. Not a big, fancy shop, but a small space, a place to call our own. I found a small room for rent on the main street of the neighborhood, a former shoe repair shop with a large, dusty window. It was modest, but to me, it was a palace. The idea was simple: create a place where I could sell my creations and, more importantly, teach other women to sew, to find their own independence. The bureaucracy of renting the space and registering a small business was an obstacle. Papers, permits, fees. Ricardo and Sophia, upon learning of my plan, intensified their pressure, threatening to file a lawsuit to have me declared legally incompetent. "You're going to burn through all the money and end up destitute," Ricardo told me over the phone. "And don't expect me to support you." Every call was an attempt to intimidate me, to make me back down. They didn't understand that it was no longer about the money. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. The tension was palpable. The bills started coming in. The rent for the new space, materials for the renovation, legal fees. The money, which once seemed like a fortune, began to dwindle. R$600 for it, R1 $200 for the initial renovation, $350 in fees. The numbers were concrete and frightening. I would find myself at night, in front of my old singer, calculating and recalculating, the fear of failure clutching at my chest. The machine, once my confidant, now seemed to judge me, its silence questioning the wisdom of my audacity. Despite everything, Isabella was my rock. She threw herself into the project wholeheartedly. During the day, she studied. In the afternoons, she helped me clean and paint the new space. She created a notebook where she jotted down ideas for the studio, with drawings of how we could arrange the shelves and what we should name the place. It was her suggestion, Dream Studio. Because, as she put it, that's what I did. I didn't sew fabrics. I sewed people's dreams into reality. The name stuck, and with it, a new wave of hope. the opening day, was approaching, and with it, the climax of this whole journey. I worked tirelessly, not just on the pieces to be sold, but on a special dress for Isabella to wear for the occasion. It would be my masterpiece, a dress that would tell our story, a symbol of everything we were fighting for. Every stitch was a declaration of independence, every baste an act of faith. The fatigue was immense, the pain in my hands constant, but for the first time in decades, I wasn't sewing out of obligation or for survival. I was sewing for purpose, and that made all the difference. The opening day of the Dream Studio dawned with a timid sun, as if the sky were hesitant to promise a happy ending. The space, once a dusty shoe repair shop, now shone. The walls, painted a luminous white, made the colorful fabrics on the shelves look like jewels. The smell was of fresh paint, clean wood, and hope. We placed a small wooden sign on the facade, hand-painted by Isabella. It was simple, almost rustic, but to us, it was grander than any neon sign in the city. I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced in a long time, a mixture of fear and joy that made my heart beat erratically, like a sewing machine at high speed. Isabella was radiant. The dress I created for her was a deep blue, the color of the night I found her crying, but now sprinkled with tiny silver embroidery, like stars of hope. The cut was simple yet elegant, and the fabric moved with her as if it were a second skin. When she looked at herself, in the mirror, her eyes filled with tears. "Elena," she whispered, "I've never felt so beautiful." In that moment, I didn't just see a young woman in a new dress. I saw living proof of my purpose, the embodiment of my act of rebellion and love. My art was no longer in the service of others' vanity, but of the restoration of dignity. Slowly, the guests began to arrive. It wasn't a crowd, just a few curious neighbors. The lady from the bakery, the owner of the grocery store, and a few women who had heard I would be giving sewing classes. There was a buzz of conversation, a community party atmosphere. Isabella, with a confidence I had never seen in her, served coffee and cookies she had baked herself. She moved through the small room with a natural grace, her joy infectious. I stood in a corner, near my old singer, which I had insisted on bringing to the shop as a throne, watching everything with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Then, Isabella stepped onto a small wooden crate, turning it into a makeshift stage. Silence fell over the studio. She held a small piece of paper, but her eyes were fixed on the audience, on me. "Many of you know me as the quiet girl who worked at the restaurant," she began, her voice steady. "Many of you saw my old clothes and my torn shoes, but what you didn't see was the kindness of a woman who, when I needed it most, didn't just give me a plate of food or a word of pity. Elena didn't just mend my jacket. She mended my soul." Her words were simple, direct, and filled with an emotion that touched everyone. She continued, now looking directly at me, tears streaming freely down her face. "This shop isn't called Dream Studio by chance. It's because Elena taught me that dreams aren't made of money or luck, but of courage and of someone believing in you. She took the broken pieces of my life and, with a needle and thread, she stitched a future for me." The emotion in the room was palpable. The lady from the bakery was drying her eyes with a handkerchief. I felt my chest tighten, a happiness so intense it hurt. All the suffering, all the humiliation, it was all worth it to reach this moment of pure, true recognition. It was at that exact moment, at the height of the emotion, that the door flew open violently. Ricardo and Sophia entered, bringing with them a cloud of anger and resentment that immediately soured the atmosphere. The party stopped. The soft music playing in the background seemed to fall silent. They glared at me, their faces contorted with fury. "So this is it," Ricardo said, his voice loud and accusatory for all to hear. "You took my father's money to set up this ridiculous little shop for your new pet daughter. You've completely lost your mind." Public humiliation was the weapon they had chosen to destroy me. Sophia, always crueler, stepped forward. "Don't be fooled by this touching scene," she said, addressing our neighbors. "My mother-in-law is sick. She is being manipulated by this gold-digging girl who only wants her money. We're trying to protect her, but she refuses to listen to us. They were trying to paint me as a victim, a senile old woman incapable of making her own decisions, a tactic to invalidate everything I had built. They wanted a scandal to prove to everyone that I was crazy and that they were the concerned children. But something unexpected happened. The lady from the bakery, a woman who had known me for 30 years, stood between me and them. "I know Elena," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I saw her sew late into the night to pay for your education, Ricardo. I saw her mend the clothes of the entire neighborhood, often for free. The only sickness I see here is your greed." One by one, other neighbors began to murmur in agreement. The community, which had once judged me, now formed a shield around me. They saw the truth, not in Ricardo and Sophia's accusations, but in my years of silent work. That support gave me the strength I needed. I stepped forward, out from behind my sewing machine. My knees were shaking, but my voice, when it came, was as steady as my best stitch. I looked at my son, the boy for whom I had sewn his first shirt, and then at my daughter-in-law, the woman who had called me a servant. A lifetime of pain condensed into that moment, not as weakness, but as fuel for my dignity. I took a deep breath, the smell of new fabric filling my lungs. The final confrontation wasn't a shout, but a declaration. "You are right about one thing," I began, and a tense silence fell. "I used your father's money, but he didn't leave me money. He left me a choice, a chance to finally do something for myself." My eyes met Ricardo's, and I saw a flicker of surprise on his face. He expected tears, please. He did not expect strength. He had never seen me as strong. Then I looked from Ricardo to Sophia, and then to Isabella, who stood beside me, holding my hand. It was then that the words that had been stuck in my throat for years finally found their way out. "The difference between you and her," I said, my voice clear and sharp, "is what you see when you look at me." The air stood still. Every person in the small studio hung on my next words, the tension almost unbearable. "You, for my entire life, saw a tool. You saw a savings account. You saw an obligation. You saw a servant." The word came out without pain this time. It came out as a fact, a piece of evidence. "She," I continued, squeezing Isabella's hand, "looked at my old hands and saw an artist. She looked at my exhaustion and saw a story. She looked at my loneliness and saw a mother. The contrast was brutal, the truth laid bare under the light of the small shop. My voice rose, filled with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. "The value you seek so much, the money you covet, is not in the bank. The true value, the only inheritance that matters, I didn't save it. I invested it. I sewed it into her life." I pointed to Isabella, to her dress, to her eyes full of future. "This is what I have done with my life. I have turned scraps into dresses and abandonment into hope, and that is something your money can never buy." Ricardo and Sophia were speechless. The community stared at them with a silent contempt that was more powerful than any insult. Defeated, not by shouts, but by the simple, undeniable truth, they turned and left the shop, swallowed by their own bitterness. The door closed behind them, and it was as if a cleansing wind had swept through the room, carrying away decades of oppression. The humiliation that had defined me for so long had transformed into my greatest act of power. In the silence that followed their departure, Isabella hugged me, and then, timidly, the lady from the bakery began to clap. Soon the entire room was applauding. They were applauding for me, Elena, the seamstress, the artist, the woman who had finally found her voice. The tears that came this time were not of pain, but of liberation. I was home, in my dream studio, surrounded not by the family of blood who had rejected me, but by a community that had embraced me. The final fitting of the dress of my life had been a success. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. In the months that followed, the dream studio blossomed in a way I could never have imagined. It ceased to be just a shop and became the beating heart of our neighborhood. The news of the confrontation with my son spread, and people came not just to buy or mend clothes. They came to offer a word of support, to share their own stories, to be part of the small revolution of dignity we had started. The order book, which I kept in a simple notebook, was quickly filled for the next 2 months. The sign on the door, which once seemed so fragile, was now a symbol of resilience. Success wasn't measured just in money, although for the first time in my life, I was financially stable. The real success was in the sound that filled the studio every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the sound of multiple sewing machines. I kept my promise and started giving free classes to vulnerable women in the community. Single mothers, young women who had dropped out of school, widows who needed a new source of income. The space transformed into a hive of creativity and mutual support, a network we wove ourselves, with threads of solidarity and needles of empowerment. Isabella was the driving force behind the modernization of our small business. While she continued her business studies with exemplary dedication, she applied everything she learned to the shop. She created a social media page for the studio, posting photos of our creations and the students in action. Soon, we started receiving orders from other cities in Texas. She taught me how to use a tablet to manage the orders, and though my arthritic fingers protested, my heart swelled with pride watching her transform into a smart, compassionate young businesswoman. Our relationship evolved from protector and protected to a true partnership, built on respect and love. A year after the opening, we reached an important milestone. We hired our first employee, Maria, one of my first students, a single mother of 3 with a natural talent for embroidery. Seeing her receive her first paycheck, a fair wage for her artistic work, was one of the most gratifying moments of my life. She looked at the check, then at me, and with teary eyes said, "Thank you, Elena. You didn't just give me a job. You gave me back my faith in myself." In that instant, I understood the true dimension of my legacy. It wasn't in the dresses hanging on the racks, but in the self-esteem we helped to stitch into every woman who walked through our door. The change in me was visible. My back still ached, and the arthritis hadn't disappeared, but I walked taller. The tired look in my eyes was replaced by a glint of purpose. The studio was my kingdom, a place where my age and my marked hands were not signs of decay, but seals of wisdom and experience. I was no longer invisible. People on the street greeted me by name. "Good morning, Doña Elena." I had found the recognition my family had denied me, not in grand gestures or riches, but in the everyday respect of my community. Happiness, I discovered, was not the absence of pain, but the presence of a purpose that transcended it. Ricardo and Sophia disappeared from my life. I heard through neighbors that Ricardo's business was not doing well and that they had moved to a smaller apartment. I felt no joy in their misfortune, only a distant melancholy. They had pursued material wealth at all costs, and in the process had lost themselves. I, on the other hand, had given up the financial security I knew and, in return, found a wealth of affection and meaning that no money could buy. My family was no longer defined by blood ties, but by bonds of loyalty, respect, and shared love, stitched together in the daily life of Yao. Our studio, the shop, became a landmark. We partnered with a local school to make their uniforms and with the neighborhood church to create the choir robes. Each new project was a celebration of our ability to create and thrive together. The sound of sewing machines became the song of our independence. We were an army of women armed with scissors and measuring tapes, redesigning not just fabric patterns, but the patterns of our own lives, proving that manual labor, so often devalued, could be a powerful tool for social and personal transformation. Isabella graduated with honors. On her graduation day, I sat in the front row, wearing an outfit I had made myself for the occasion. When she walked onto the stage to receive her diploma, she looked out at the audience and our eyes met. Her smile was my greatest trophy. She was no longer the scared girl in torn clothes. She was a confident, educated woman with a bright future ahead of her, a future we had stitched together. She became the official manager of the studio, bringing a vision and energy that would ensure our dream continued for many years to come. I finally understood the meaning of my mother's words. Every stitch is a promise. My entire life had been a long succession of stitches, of promises made and sometimes broken. But now, I was no longer mending the tears of the past. I was weaving a new fabric, a rich and vibrant tapestry made of many hands and many hearts. Sewing taught me that even the most forgotten and worn-out scraps can, when joined with love and purpose, create something beautiful and strong. My studio was no longer just a corner of a room, but a space of infinite possibilities. The yellowish light over my sewing machine no longer illuminated my nightly loneliness, but the hopeful faces of my students. The hum of my old singer was no longer a lament, but a symphony of new beginnings. I had discovered that my true calling was not just to sew fabrics, but to rebuild futures, basting hope, where there was despair and dignity, where there was humiliation. The measuring tape that once measured bodies now measured progress. The scissors that once cut fabric now cut the ties of dependency. The needle and thread, my lifelong tools, became the perfect metaphor for my journey. The thread, representing the continuity of life and knowledge, and the needle, showing that sometimes you must pierce the surface to be able to join and heal. My future was no longer a blank page, but a fabric, waiting to be embroidered with new colors and new stories. Looking out the studio window, watching Isabella laugh with a customer as she took her measurements, I felt at peace. The cycle of pain and abandonment had been broken. I was no longer anyone's servant. I was Elena, the founder of the Dream Studio, the matriarch of a new family I had stitched myself, with the strongest threads that exist, the threads of love, resilience, and dignity. And that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. To leave to the world. I continue to sew. My hands still ache, but now every stitch is an act of celebration. Every dress that leaves our studio carries with it a piece of our story, a testament that it is possible, even with the most tired hands and the most wounded heart, to sew a destiny of beauty and purpose. The thread continues to run, the needle continues to dance, and the future is a vast and promising fabric waiting to be created. My life is proof that the hands that sew fabrics can also sew destinies, and my destiny finally was in my own hands. I no longer needed approval or recognition from those who did not value me. My worth was there, in the sparkle in the eyes of the women I helped, in Isabella's success, in the joyful, constant sound of the sewing machines in my studio. I had found my place in the world, not in a mansion, but in a small neighborhood shop, where dreams were cut, sewn, and delivered with love. Have you ever done a kind gesture that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more stories of second chances. Comment, "Love has no price," if you also believe in human kindness.